In this video, we're going to break down the 7 milestones for you to focus on and keep track of on your journey towards success as a coach. Some of them are internal and some of them are external. They'll give you more confidence and ultimately help you make more money. What we're going to give you guys is 7 specific milestones that you can look forward to and hopefully be able to recognize, okay, I'm doing that one, or I did that one, or if you haven't yet focused on this or made this a target, then you'll have some practical, implementable awarenesses and assessments and targets. We're going to get into another relatively deep dissection of this content because I think it's really important. And if you don't know, you can speed up the videos so you can listen to us a little bit faster and consume, an hour's worth of content in 30 minutes or 45 minutes by adjusting the playback speed in your app or on your desktop. So be more proficient with your time and get through some of these longer videos if that's going to support you. And as we break down this conversation, we dissect some of this stuff. We want it to be engaging. We want it to be interactive. So if anything really lands for you, whether it's a certain phrase or a realization that you have, let us know. Put a comment down in the comment section here and let us know what really landed for you, or if you have any follow-up questions, because these kinds of dissection sort of discussions are only valuable to you if you engage in them. And so we want to produce and facilitate the engagement and the interaction inside these conversations. So join us in the comment section as we unpack all this looking back wisdom. What we're doing with this particular video and with several of the videos, and many of you that watch this channel, I'm sure you're recognizing this, but you might not have this language. I mean, we didn't even have this language until this morning when we were talking about this. Is what we're doing is we're taking a lot of conversations that are happening at our highest level of community, meaning people that are going through the highest level of our certification programs. They are committed to being a coach, and they've practiced, they've studied, they've gone to they did the online program, they went to a live 5-day event, online or in person, and they're in this mastery level dissection of the work. And so we're taking a lot of the conversations at this high level perspective, and we're breaking them down so that hopefully you all can see yourself somewhere in this journey. So I had this visual earlier today. It was like school-aged children, elementary school, middle school, high school, wherever you are in that spectrum, hearing from people that have gotten their PhDs, like a panel of PhD, in this case, coaches saying, this is how we got our PhD. This is how we got successful. This is how we became confident and certain. And that's an extremely valuable conversation. However, the problem with that is when PhDs speak to people in middle school or people in high school or anywhere along that spectrum, a lot of times there's too much of a gap, too much distance between the people on the panel and the people in the audience, like wanting to listen. So what we're trying to do, hopefully somewhat successfully for you, is take that conversation and bridge the gap. So the conversation is really important because what we're wanting to give you is looking back wisdom. We're wanting to give you the wisdom based on us looking back on our journey. And what most people are searching for is looking forward answers, looking forward intelligence, looking forward knowledge, right? So as I look forward on my journey, what's the thing that I need to know? And really, when we ask that kind of question, which is, it's impossible not to ask that question. That's a part of the way our brain works. When we ask that question, though, we're operating from our current perspective. That's the thing to understand. We're operating from our current perspective, and we can't know what's on the other side of the journey. So what we are wanting to offer you is looking back wisdom, but still with the going forward perspective. That's what we're trying to connect here. And too often, that's not connected And the outcome of that is disastrous, because if you're looking forward with the current perspective that you have, which of course we all are, and you only trust answers that match your current perspective, you'll never be able to actually evolve, because the answers of the looking back wisdom are not even to questions you're currently asking, because those are not what we're looking for. Like, we're not actually looking for, we can't ask the questions that we're ignorant about in order to get the answers to them. And so what we're giving is, what are the answers to the questions that we didn't even know we had? And looking back on our journey, what are the things that we actually needed that we didn't know that we needed? And so as we were talking about this earlier today, I had this visual of people walking around, like we're all doing this, with like a little flashlight, you know, from our phone, or a little actual flashlight. And we're looking around the next step area of our footing. So we're just seeing, are there rocks? Are there any things to avoid? And what we want to do is help you keep that next step focused, but also open up these floodlights that will illuminate a lot more of the story as well, and the territory. And the reason that's really important is because we have to have both. We have to have short term, but we also have to have long term. And any journey that involves personal evolution is going to be something that the ego doesn't want to experience because it takes too long. It doesn't match what the ego wants, is preservation of energy and avoidance of failure and avoidance of embarrassment. And we want the outcome of growth without growing, essentially, is what the ego is looking for. So anytime that you illuminate the truth of a certain journey that's going to require personal growth, two things happen. Number one, we have resistance to that journey. And that's why we want to break this down for all of you in the way that we're doing, is because we want you to know that the resistance is okay. It's not only okay, it's a requirement of the journey. It's a part of this process. But the second thing that happens, and this is really what we want to deliver with these videos, is that you recognize there's a reason to keep going, so that you see the bigness of all of this, and you recognize the resistance is for a purpose. So you might immediately resist because of the areas of the brain that don't like the process of growth, but you also need to see the illumination of what's possible in the growth, and also know that you're not a screw up if you feel insecurities, that you're not a loser if you still have fear and still have pain, or still have any of the uncomfortable stuff that most of us are trying to get through. You're not alone in that process. In fact, it's a requirement of the process. And what most of us are actually doing is we're seeking to nurture our insecurities. We're seeking to compensate for our insecurities, and to salve them. I think that's the word. Like, you put ointment or something on a wound, right? It's like, that's kind of what we're wanting. We're looking for the ointment for our insecurities, basically, but not so that they actually heal from inside, just so that we can put a Band-Aid over them and, you know, cover them up and not have to feel them. So that's what the ego is generally doing. And that's why we ask the questions that we ask when we're looking forward, because we're just wanting to try to avoid the pain, or we're wanting the shortcut, right? And all of that is, again, it's a part of being human. So we also can't get rid of that neurological desire to conserve energy and to avoid any kind of discomfort. We all have that, but we need to open up the idea that this is a part of the process, because I think in the coaching industry, most coaches quit while they're on the right path. Most coaches quit while they're doing the right things. Now, maybe they're not doing enough of them, but the right path feels wrong because it's paved with all this growth stuff, right? All these learnings and lessons, but just a bunch of mirrors on that path, right? So the right path feels wrong. And we'll dive into that in another video, the idea of what feeling right and feeling wrong is. Yeah. But just to quickly give a piece of that, feeling right to most of us means comfortable, and feeling wrong is uncomfortable. So if anything is uncomfortable, then it doesn't feel right to us. So then we're going to search for another feeling right journey. And the sad part is that most coaches quit while they're feeling wrong on the right journey. And that's what we want to hopefully deliver with these videos, that the feeling wrong part is right. Like, that's actually, you're going in the right direction if it feels wrong in the sense of it being uncomfortable or just not what you expected. So that's sort of the frame of not just this particular conversation, but what we're wanting to bring to all of you with these unpacking videos. And this is all based on experience. It's not based on theory. So we're not telling you what we think is true. We're looking back on our journey, and not just our journey, but in our communities of coaches who are going through the work, and the people that we talk to all the time that have finished all of this work, and what they're telling us is important. And what's cool about that, Michelle, just a few years ago, we had this idea that we think this missing piece is this, this third level that we ended up building. And now what we're hearing from people that are leaving that is the confirmation of what was once theory in our minds, at least in terms of, taking a community through it. So hopefully this community-based, high-level, mastery-level, community-based conversations open up perspective for all of you guys, but then also give you some what to do now steps. All right, so this came out of conversations you've been having specifically with people, and that was the impetus of this whole video in this conversation. So why don't you share a little bit more about that story in terms of what people are asking you in the conversations you're in, but then your answer to it, because I think that is a really profound piece to all of this. Like, what were your milestones?
Yeah, it actually, and it makes sense, right, Sean? Because we talk about like this being a journey, this coaching being a journey, and encouraging, right, people that are watching to look at it like a journey of mastery, right, not a short-term success. And when you're on a longer journey, just like if you're running a marathon, right, there's moments of like bliss and yes, and you're feeling good and in the zone, and there's other moments that it's hard and it's not easy, that becoming a coach journey. And so some of the students have asked, like, how'd you make it? Right? Like, what are the things that you actually did to keep going along the journey? How did you overcome the obstacles and the challenges? And what are those milestones? And
let me pause you there, because some people, if you're new to this channel, new to us individually, I just want you to know why people are asking Michelle that question. So Michelle, inside of our programs, is doing a lot of the teaching and a lot of the mentoring. So at our highest level program, everybody gets connected with a mentor coach, somebody that's done this work, thousands and thousands and thousands of hours. And so Michelle is the mentor coach for a lot of people, and they see her on stage, co-facilitating, teaching certain concepts and specific exercises in the coaching world and so forth. So in our coaching community, Michelle is a leader of the community, and that's why she's getting these questions, because people are seeing her as a mentor and somebody to follow and going, how'd you get there? But they know about her, and they know her individually because, number one, she's just open, but they're in individual conversations a lot. So that gives them access to ask this kind of a question. So I just want to make sure that everybody understands the seat that you sit in order to be asked that question.
Thank you for that. And when it was first asked, I didn't want to respond right away because the question felt really sacred. And so I wanted to give it like time and give it thought and really reflect back, because I think it's so easy along our journeys to forget all the things that we did and all the things that we moved through and overcame. And I was actually in the shower this morning, and I was just reflecting, like, where was I and what were some of the thoughts that I was thinking? And I got really emotional. I honestly started crying this morning, just thinking about like what this path was for me. And the milestone question in the moment was hard. And I think I had to move through what I moved through to get to what we're going to give you inside of this video today, right? These 7 milestones. Because what I started to think about is, I'm like, milestones, like let's see, I questioned my worth and my role inside of, all of my relationships, right? Like personal ones, marriage, professional, friendships, my relationship with my own self, right? I doubted everything, that I knew what I was talking about, that anybody would listen to me, right? That I actually had any stories, right? Or anything of value that anybody would actually care about. I looked to other people to tell me what the right thing to do was. Like, that was a milestone for me, was actually like, okay, I'm a good student and I'm going to listen to what my teacher tells me to do. And that was significant. And on that path, I redefined what that was for myself, which was another milestone for me. Sean, writing my book, writing my story, that was significant for me. That was a milestone. Trying to sell an online program that nobody wanted and completely bombed, that was a milestone for me. Lots of failure, and making phone calls that, like, to try to get booked to speak, that people didn't call me back on, and that I wasn't really sure that actually had anything valuable that anybody would want to say. And confronting my perfectionism was a milestone, and trying to be anybody else other than myself, right? That was significant for me along the journey. My commitment to being anybody other than who I was, and facing like my wounds and my traumas, and you name it, whatever this looks like for you. But I mean, this could be things like codependency or counterdependency, or mother wounds or father wounds, self-esteem, unworthiness, perfectionism, huge for me, procrastination, insecurity, that manifested in over apologizing, and distrust in self, and guilt and shame, and working to get chosen by other people instead of choosing myself. Feeling empty and lost, and looking in the mirror and being like, where is this going? And am I crazy? And was life really better before I started doing all of this? Like, all of these things, they were milestones. And I don't even think I said this to you when we were chatting earlier, but I think the emotion, Sean, was because I recognized that all of these things that I was wishing weren't happening were actually the most significant milestones, which I use that word as like, that's a great thing. That's a thing I want to remember of my journey. And that's where I think the emotion actually came from.
That's a really powerful statement. And that can only come from looking back wisdom. Yeah. To recognize that while you were going forward, these were all the things you were trying to avoid. And while you're looking back, those were the most powerful lessons you ever learned. And I think most of us would agree that in our lives, when we look back, the biggest lessons we ever learn are through adversity. But yet when we're going forward, we're all trying to avoid adversity. So right out of the gate, we're setting ourselves up to try to avoid the only thing that's going to give us the lessons that we need. And that's the perpetual conflict, I think, between what we want and what we need. So what we're wanting is to avoid all the stuff that's uncomfortable. What we need is to go through the discomfort. What we're talking about here is for any of you that are interested in deep work coaching. This is not surface level stuff. You don't have to do any of the stuff that we're going to talk about if you're wanting to sell commodities, if you're wanting to sell just products that people will buy. And I'm not saying that with judgment, because that's a very valid road. If you don't want to be in the world of deep coaching, then you don't have to do any of the stuff that's required for deep coaching. What we're talking about is for people that are interested in and committed to the deeper work that obviously has changed our lives tremendously. And the deeper the work that you're willing to do, or the deeper the impact that you want to have, and the deeper the experience you want on this planet as a human, the deeper you're going to have to swim. You know, we always give the analogy in our coaching between snorkeling and scuba diving. If you want to see what's at the depths of the ocean, you have to scuba dive. You can't do that snorkeling. If you want to see what's at the depths of humanity, you've got to scuba dive. And there are some beautiful things at the bottom of the ocean that most people will never see. There's also darkness at the bottom of the ocean that a lot of people are afraid of. And we want to be really, really clear that when you do the deep work, there can be discomfort, and there can be pain, and there can be fears, and there can be a lot of the stuff that there was for us, but it doesn't have to be excruciating. It doesn't have to be miserable. What causes it to be miserable for a lot of people is their relationship to the journey that we're trying to illuminate here. But the more that you recognize this is the journey, the easier it'll be to keep going, because you understand this is a part of the process that I want to be on. This is a part of the process that's required to produce the outcome that I want to have. So understanding that it can get bumpy and rocky and uncertain at times will help you move through it. But the majority of the people, it's like that phrase, throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because they don't want to feel the discomfort, they also sacrifice the depths of happiness and joy that's in the human experience as well. So this deep work is what we're referring to, and that's what all these milestones are going to be relevant for. You mentioned the marathon analogy. I think that's a really good analogy. My wife ran a marathon a couple of years ago, and she learned that at a certain point, I think it's like mile 20, your body just hits a wall, especially if you've not run a marathon before, you're not a pro at it or haven't run a bunch of them. And if you don't know that your body will just hit a wall, then you'll probably quit, because it'll just slam you and you just go like, I don't want to take another step. But she learned, and from my discussion with a lot of marathon runners, if you know what to do when you hit that wall, then you can keep going. But if you don't know that there will be a wall, you won't know what to do when you hit the wall.
You'll freak out.
Part of that is nutrition. Part of that is training. Part of that is mentality. Part of that is expectations. Like, there's so much that goes into a marathon. And you think about the training of a marathon, so much goes into the preparation of it, so that when you're in that race for several hours and your body goes through all the ups and downs that you cannot avoid unless you're this professional marathoner and you just run them in, 3 hours or so. I don't know what the actual time of, world records is, but unless you could just like sprint all the way through it because your body's just used to it. And that's actually a valid part of the conversation, because those people still have the walls. It's just not within 26 miles anymore. But if they were going to do a super marathon and run 50 miles or 100 miles or something like that, then their body would hit those same walls. So their resistance is just no longer within that 26-mile window anymore. But almost everybody's resistance is. And maybe I'm ignorant, maybe they do still hit that. I don't know, but conceptually at least, the journey gets, like, the window gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So, and then there's some people that hit that resistance in trying to run a mile because their body's not conditioned to that. That's actually what my wife did. She couldn't even, like, her goal was to run a mile under 10 minutes. She was never a runner. And then once she got into it, she liked it. And then she ended up running a marathon a few years later. So she actually had that huge resistance. She didn't even think she could run a mile. And so anyway, the point is, there's this journey, and you have to understand the ups and downs and ins and outs, and when you need water, and when you need a candy bar, and when you need, God, and when you need to breathe, and when you need to stop running, and when you need to just take in all the sights. Like, there's so many things that you need along the journey, and they're different things according to different phases of the journey. And our stop phase might hit in mile 2 for some of us, but not till mile 25 for some of us. So there's a lot of variations and distinctions in our journeys, but to understand the human process, the marathon analogy is quite profound. And then you also mentioned you questioning your role in everything. And that's because if you're willing to do deep work, then you're going to focus on self. And all of those things touch self. So your relationship with your body, and your money, and your marriage, and your job, and your purpose on life, like, all of those things are going to touch because you are at the center of the clock. So it doesn't matter what we look at around the edges of the clock. Those are all the different topics. They all touch the center, which is you. So when we focus on ourselves and our own personal transformations, it'll touch all of these areas of our lives. And that's good or bad, depending on the way you look at it. It could be bad for some people that go, oh, I got to confront all these things. But the reality is, it's really good to recognize, no, you can actually influence all these things by only focusing on one. Because if you can do the inner work at the center of the clock, then all of the things around the edge of the clock are touched and are influenced by the work that you do in the middle. And again, if you have that shift of perspective, then it'll be easier to go, okay, then I guess I'm just going to question all this stuff, and how can you not question all the things that your life has been built upon, if you're doing this internal work? It's just it's a part of this process. So before we get into these 7 milestones, which are now 8, based on what you said, what a lot of people are asking, not just in the community that we're talking about, but just in the coaching industry in general, is they're asking people who have come out of the oven the microwave recipe, right? Because the ego wants the microwave. So they're asking you, in this case. A lot of people are going, wow, I really like your level of confidence and certainty, and I like your abilities as a coach, and I like the way you move in the world, and I like your poetry, and I like the things that you do, and I like what I see and experience from you. How do I get there? And you're like, okay, well, here's the recipe to follow. And then you put it in the oven, and then you bake it for a while. And they're like, no. I don't want to follow the recipe, and I don't want to bake it in the oven. I just want to get there. I want the microwave, the microwave process to get what only an oven can produce. And when you give me the microwave process that only an oven can produce, can you remove the microwave part? Because, it's still like, I don't want to deal with any of that stuff. So in reality, the majority of us, and again, this is the way the human brain works. I still want this. I know you, and you do too. This is a part of the neurology of the brain. Right. We all want the non-microwave, microwave way to get what only an oven can produce. We all want it.
Right.
But can we learn that that's not possible, and then value the oven process
Yes.
and recognize that it'll get hot sometimes in the form of discomfort, but it's the only way that what comes out of the oven can be produced. So that's where all of this is coming from. And we want you to have the big looking back wisdom frame so that this makes sense in the way that we're even explaining it. And the things that we're saying, like, again, we're looking back. So you said something and caused me to add a bonus 8th milestone, but I'm going to say it first.
Okay.
You said you launched a program or you created an online program that bombed and nobody wanted. One of the milestones, this is the bonus milestone, and it will show up throughout the whole process, but it's really important in the beginning of anybody's journey. The bonus milestone is abject failure, meaning you sell a program that nobody buys. You promote a webinar that nobody attends. You send something out that nobody opens. Abject failure, like ultimate failure. And I don't have time in this video to tell you a bunch of mine, to break all of them down. But there's been so many.
Right.
There's been so many. All the things that I just said, events that nobody went to, webinars, programs that nobody bought, all of that stuff has been a part of my journey as well. And one of the most painful experiences is when I went on, I scheduled a tour through Canada and I set 5 events. And this was going to be the thing that was going to launch my business into 7 figures, because I was following somebody else's recipe who did have a 7-figure business. And this is what it looked like with all these live events and selling all these programs and stuff. And the first event, which was supposed to have 200 people, had 9. And that's only because the day before I talked 3 of them into coming as a family for free to a $97 event. And I canceled the other 4 because nobody registered. I think 1 person registered in total for the other 4 events. So we're talking about extreme embarrassment, extreme pain, and thousands and thousands and thousands of hard costs lost in plane tickets. I think I bought a plane ticket to at least the first event, in hotel reservations. You know, it's interesting. The hotels didn't just go, oh, okay, nobody bought your thing. Well, then you don't have to pay for our hotel anymore. You know, that contract that you signed, we'll let you out of it because nobody bought your thing. So I had to pay all the expenses that I had pre-committed to, all the shipping costs, all that stuff. But in creating these events, I put all my focus on that. So what it really did is it took 3 to 6 months out of my business where I would have been doing something else. So the opportunity costs, or the lost dollars that I would have made if I would have just stayed focused on what was working the year before, you know, we're potentially talking about maybe $100,000, if not more, of redirected failure. Because instead of doing what was working at a very high level, I pulled the plug out from there and focused on this, and then all of that failed. So I lost a lot of hard costs, but I missed out on a lot of would have been revenue. So my point is, that was one of the most painful things that I've ever experienced. And I don't want any of you to experience that to the level that I experienced it. But in truth, I do hope every single one of you experiences abject failure in something that you do, because it truly is one of the most powerful teachers that we have, because it will cause you to question things. It will, and some of it's strategic and some of it's internal. It's like, is anybody interested in this particular message? I had a client who was offering a 3-day seminar that nobody was purchasing. And so we talked about the messaging that might be wrong and the length of time in this case that might be wrong. And what we ended up doing is, instead of offering a 3-day seminar, and so many people are seminared out, especially online now, she offered a 1-day, and it sold out like that with a different focus. So we condensed the offer and it immediately became attractive. Now, to us as coaches, we're like, if people like the 1-day, they would love the 3-day because we're offering so much more value. And everybody's like, nah, I'm not interested in that. But as soon as we found the messaging that was right for this particular market, then the attraction exploded. So sometimes the questions we'll ask ourselves will be strategic in nature, and we'll adjust the messaging, we'll adjust the price, we'll adjust the marketing, we'll adjust the market. We'll adjust some things in the strategic world that will make it become successful. Then other times we'll just question ourselves. Is this something that I really want to do? Is, like, for me, one of my abject failures was way back in 2008, 2009. I designed a full-on business campaign and like whole business, really, customer journey for parenting, which I thought was incredibly valuable. I still know it's valuable, but it was getting no success whatsoever. Even though I was following the exact same template that had generated not millions, but hundreds of thousands of dollars the year before. I took that same template and applied it over here, and it was literally producing nothing. And so one of the questions I asked myself is this what I want to do right now? And it caused me to pivot and not focus on that and focus on something else. So the point is, abject failure, and abject failure is complete failure, where like almost emotionally destructive for a lot of people. But I wish that for you with my looking back wisdom. I don't wish that for you with your looking forward desires, but I wish that for you with my looking back wisdom, so that I can look back and so I can just kind of take this abject failure experience for you and go, oh, she's learning. The muscles are being built right now. Now, very, very rarely will anybody tell you that complete and utter failure is one of the milestones. And nobody's looking forward to that. Like, man, how can I find abject failure? That's one of those things that nobody's looking for, but everybody recognizes the importance of looking back. So that's your bonus milestone that hopefully, again, will illuminate that if you've had any of these experiences, you're not alone. And if you don't know that's part of the process, it's probably just because people aren't talking about that as being part of their process, because that's not the sexy stuff that actually sells. It's only the real stuff that actually is truthful, right? It's the real stuff that actually works. And if you haven't experienced abject failure, then take more actions, and hopefully you will. So that's my bonus milestone. Anything you want to add to that before we get to the other 7?
It's just so valuable to know, so that when it happens, we don't think we're doing something wrong, did something wrong, or that we should quit. And that's your body is going to shut down, right? And then when it happens, it doesn't mean you love it. It just means you're like, oh, Sean, they talked about this. Okay. All right. Got it. This is part of the process. And that is so incredibly valuable.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about earlier, that most coaches are on the right path, but they're creating the misery because they've decided that they shouldn't have failure. Yes. And the more truthful a message is, the more likely the abject failure will be, especially in the beginning. So before we get into these milestones, we want you to know that the way we are presenting them here aren't necessarily in a chronological order. The first one is intentional and the last one is intentional in their order. But your journey, where you are right now in your journey, what kind of coaching you're doing, and all the individual variables that are unique to you could move certain milestones in their order. But we're going to sandwich them with the first one and the last one, because we do actually think that those are critical in the order of how you go through these. All right, let's get to these 7 milestones. This first one is an exercise that we want you all to do. And surprise, it might not be super comfortable for all of you. If it is really comfortable, then either you've done this before and you're just comfortable with this part of the journey, or you're not doing it at a depth. To Michelle's point, if it gets uncomfortable, you'll hopefully remember, oh, they said it was going to be.
Right.
This wasn't something that anybody taught me about the importance of, like that it would be one of those milestone moments. I interviewed somebody years ago. His name's Brendan Smith, and his introduction for me to bring him on to my interview was wildly authentic. And he had written an article, and it was something like Confessions of a Perfectionist. It was a more clever title than that, but that was the essence of it. And it was all about like, I'm struggling with this in my life and I'm dealing with this. And oh, by the way, I've got this high level degree, which means I shouldn't have this. But in reality, I question myself. And I just thought that was so cool that he was real and transparent. So then I thought, what if I did that? And shortly after that, I decided to write an about me story that told the whole truth. And it took me a while to write the story. I think it took me like a full day of just nonstop writing. Not that it has to take anybody that long or that you have to do it in one day. You can piece it together. But I wrote my full about me story that any of you can watch. We'll put a link, or any of you can read. We'll put a link to it. There's actually a podcast. And let's put the link to the podcast also, if you want to just listen to it. Yeah. And it's actually why Michelle is on the screen right now. We'll talk about that here in a moment. But I told the full story about me and about bankruptcy and about my limiting beliefs and about the fears that I had, like all through my whole life, not just as a coach. Because usually when we tell people about ourselves, we want to tell them the impressive stuff. And I just wrote this story like, listen, I just want to tell you the real stuff. And so I told about all the financial mistakes I made and the stupid things that I did. But there was at least some level of empowerment in it. You know, it wasn't just like, let me just air all my dirty laundry. It was like, this is what I did, and this is what I learned, and this is what I did, and this is what I learned, and this is how I lost, and this is how I learned. And it was this real cathartic experience for me, like just a real healing experience for me. And I was able to look at this story and go, I've actually done a lot of stuff. So it gave me a lot of belief in myself and my journey. And that's one of the things that I've found people get when they actually do this, is they recognize how much or how deep their authority and credibility is in some area or several areas of their life. And when most of us look at what can we teach, especially if we want to build a business, we're thinking about what will sell and what will people really like and what are people asking for. And a lot of times that's not the real story. So we don't even think about this stuff until we make it an explicit, intentional exercise. So what I want all of you to do is to write your about me story. Now I'd love to see them. So come back to this video or send us an email and send us a link to your story. Because people need to know that we're all just humans helping humans. You know, we're all just healing humans, hopefully trying to heal other humans. And we actually have a lot more connection and trust in our imperfections and the human journey than in our uber accomplishments and all the impressive stuff that we want to tell people about. The other thing that it will do is it will help you see potentially where you've got more work to do. Because if you don't have a, this is what I learned part of this is how I lost, if you're still in the, this is how I'm losing right now, or this is what I'm really struggling with, and you don't have a, this is what I learned yet, well, then you can't teach that one. Don't teach that class because you don't have a, this is what I learned yet, which is what people need. So it will expose what you can teach and potentially what you shouldn't be teaching right now. But it just has this intimate, like connecting sort of effect, which was completely unintentional for me. And one of the things that it did is it exposed a realization of a story of when my father jumped off a curb. And I had never told that story until I wrote this about me piece. I never even told that story. So sometimes our signature stories will come out of this about me story, as it did for me. And as I've heard other people as well, because we're intentionally putting our story on paper or speaking it out or however you express it. So this story became this signature piece. Like that's the story that I told in 2013 and won North America's Next Greatest Speaker with that story. That story got me taken to India for 2.5 weeks. It was called the Jump Tour, all based on my father's jump story, all because I wrote this without any of those intentions. But that's what came out of it. So it can be a seed that blossoms into so many areas internally and maybe even strategically for some of you, if you do the about me story. So this is the only exercise, like go do this, that's on this list of milestones. And that's why we wanted to start with it, because it will actually put a lot of these other things into motion. And I know, because you've told me this, that you read my about me story back when, of course, I didn't know who you were, and I can't tell who's reading the stuff on my website. And I know, from what you've shared, you read that story, then shut your computer or turned it off and then came back sometime later. But there was something about that story that you resonated with, even though almost none of our details are the same, other than, we're human and we breathe oxygen. I don't know that anything else is really similar in terms of details, but there was something that resonated with you, which eventually, turned into where we are now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's it is the human, right? You said there's nothing in common except that we're humans, right? Breathing oxygen. That's the thing that connected, right? Was that you were a human who had a story on a website, who I knew enough of to know that you were a successful coach and you had, like a YouTube channel, you had content, you created things, and yet you were also all these other things that in my story, I had convinced myself I had to get rid of all of those things in order to get to the success that I saw you having, that I wanted. So it gave me permission to be who I was and be able to move forward. And that terrified me initially, which is why I did actually shut the computer and go away. And I didn't go away for like an hour. I think it was like a year. And I was like, okay, let me read this person's story again. And I felt the same thing. I bawled because it just put me in touch with my own truth. And the other thing that you said that I think is really critical is that you didn't write the story with the agenda. You didn't write the story to try and get me or other clients. You didn't write the story to try to get the signature story. You wrote the story to tell the story. And so it was pure in that place. It wasn't, it was written agendaless. And that's important. So when you do this, write it not for any other purpose other than your relationship with your story, not how anybody else is going to see it or relate to it. And I don't say that to say that unfiltered, unedited story is what you're going to put on your website or is what you're going to tell anybody. Yeah, because that's not necessarily the case, but you've got to get that out raw. You've got to just let yourself, most of us have never even articulated our journeys in
Right.
such a way that we could actually see it and have our own experience of getting it out and reading it ourselves. And then we can go through the editing and all of that other stuff before we put it out for anybody else to see. But you got to write it unfiltered.
Yeah, that's such an important piece. I thought of it earlier, but forgotten. I would have forgotten. So I'm glad you brought that up. When we write and edit at the same time,
yes,
it's not pure.
No.
Because we're editing usually according to other people's perceptions of us, and we're trying to get approval, and like there's desperation in the editing, or there's avoidance of the embarrassment. And there's a difference between producing something and publishing something. So what we want you to do is produce the full movie of your life, produce the full story. And if it causes you to cry, great. If it causes you to laugh, great. If it takes a week or a month or a year or just a day, whatever, like the process doesn't have any parameters around it, because it depends on where you are in your journey. But produce the whole story. And then, to Michelle's point, you might not publish that whole story on the website, but at least you've gotten it out for the purposes that it has for you, the internal purposes. And maybe you're the only one that ever reads your full story, and that's fine. But then you can shift and go, okay, this is what I'm going to put up on a website, and this is what I'm going to share on a podcast, or this is what I'm going to do a video about, or this is what I'm going to do, whatever. And it's the expression of the story that can only teach you certain lessons that will never be taught in the edited version of the story.
Right.
So get it out, maybe edit later before you actually publish, but get it out for the purposes that it has for you internally. I can't overstate the importance of this step.
Yeah.
And surprise, most people
almost
won't do
nobody does it.
Yeah, most people won't do it.
Yeah.
I don't know how many times we've broken down what we just did, even at a much deeper level, even inside of a paid program.
Yep.
People that paid over $2,000.
Mm-hmm.
Most people didn't do it.
Yeah.
Which is because of the dichotomy, because of the conflict of what I want to be true and looking back wisdom. And I'm at this point now where I don't try to convince people anymore. You really got to do this. Here, let me do everything I possibly can to convince you to do this. I just sit back and go, oh, you don't want to do what's required? Okay. And not because I hope people fail, but because what I've learned is that there's a way, or the way. There's only the way. And some people will just choose to not do it, and a small percentage will. And then only the small percentage that will choose to do it has the ability to get the outcomes of it, right? And so I don't say that to be demeaning or judgmental, because to your point, people like you will choose not to do it now, but then come back to it later.
Yeah.
And actually, one of the worst things that we can do, so this is part of my evolution actually as a coach, one of the worst things we can do is force people onto a path before they choose it. So in that moment where you shut the laptop, if somehow I or somebody else would have forced you on that path, maybe you would have never actually chosen onto it. So this is one of those situations where I recognize the explorer needs to choose the exploration. Because if the explorer is forced into the exploration, it won't work as powerfully. And in one of the videos that I did recently, I learned that from a neurological standpoint, that when we're forced into something, our body actually shows up different
Oh,
than
yeah.
when we choose something.
Yep.
Like literally, we bring different feelings. We bring different embodied. It's like we bring a different team to the process
Yeah.
from an embodied standpoint, not just a willpower, motivational standpoint. These next 6 milestones are more conceptual.
Yeah.
They're more internal focused. And because of that, we're not going to break them down with the same level of time and unpacking, because they just show up differently for different people. But again, looking back, what are some of the internal shifts that we made, some of the identity shifts that we made, and what has been some of the most profound needle movers in our journeys?
Yeah.
So this second one is the shift from conditional commitment to unconditional commitment. And I'm sure we've already touched on a lot of these things, right? Just because we've been talking for a little while here. And the concepts that are foundational in nature just tend to make their way into most conversations, right? So
they're foundational.
Because they're foundational. The conditional commitment is I'm committed as long as, or I'm committed unless. I'm committed unless it costs money. I'm committed unless it's really uncomfortable. I'm committed unless it's going to take a while. I'm committed unless it requires an oven, not a microwave. All these conditional commitments meaning that we're committed only if certain conditions are met. But those conditions are usually ego conditions of comfort. People that are conditionally committed for comfort, maybe we can put those together. Comfortable, conditionally committed. Can never produce transformation. So you've got to get to the point where you're unconditionally committed. And usually what that involves is some moment, some connection to an experience that you need people to feel. Many of you have heard my story of the piano bench moment back in 2005 in a crowded hotel where a life coach changed my life. I was sitting on a piano bench because there was nowhere else to sit. He fundamentally changed my life. In about 15 minutes, I got up off that piano bench and I made a promise to myself, everybody needs to feel this. And that is when I shifted into this unconditional commitment to where I can't not do this. And you spoke to this earlier, Michelle, where in your process, there are conditions that will cause us to doubt or conditions that will cause us to contemplate quitting. There has to be an unconditional commitment greater than our conditional adversity. If we have an unconditional commitment greater than our conditional adversity, then we'll keep going. If we don't, then we won't. So getting to that point where you can't not do this work is a requirement so that you have a fuel stronger than your obstacles. And there will be obstacles because they have to be there. So until you get to the fuel that's stronger than your obstacles, there will be something that knocks you out. Anything you want to add?
I don't think that we can plan this. I think this just happens in the process, right? Like, it's not like you were searching for the unconditional commitment, right? Like when you went to that event, right, and you had your piano bench moment, right? I think this is something that just when you're
people
in the
should
work,
be walking around with a piano bench, just going, okay, the piano bench is going to happen at 3:30 tonight.
Right.
There, right?
Exactly.
In the library with the candlestick, me and my piano bench moment. We're going to it can't be intentionally manufactured. I think that's a really critical point.
Yeah. It just happens when you're doing the work and you're in the process and you're committing to these other like milestones, right? This is something that will happen, and it'll be something that you notice looking back, not something that you're searching for moving forward.
Exactly. You took the words right out of my mouth. You said it perfectly. The third milestone, and all these are related to each other because that's the nature of fundamentals. The third milestone that was really critical for Michelle and me, it's just that we were a generation apart really. And I don't mean like a generation of humans, you know, where we're 20 years apart, but a generation in terms of the internet where I had laser focus. So the milestone is to go from fragmented focus to laser focus.
Yeah.
I had laser focus largely because that's what was available. Because when I became a coach, there was no social media. I mean, it was just in the very, very infantile stages. So I didn't have all the mass distraction that people have nowadays if they're relatively early in the journey. What I did is I laser focused and I followed pretty much one person at a time. And I know that's part of your story too. And what we have nowadays is so many seductive distractions. And we live in a world that literally, especially online and social media, literally buys and sells human attention. That's the currency. That's the currency of social media platforms. That's the currency of traditional media. They're trying to buy and sell attention. So what are they doing? They're fighting each other to get our attention. What's the outcome of that? We are constantly being bombarded with distractions. And that distraction creates fragmented focus. So in the coaching industry, the way that looks is people have all these different inputs. You know, you might be following 30 different people. You're on 50 different email lists. You're in all kinds of different programs, a lot of times simultaneously.
Yep.
And I know we were in that conversation just the other day, where now, after the pandemic, especially what we're hearing from a lot of people in the personal development industry is they are simultaneously in a ton of programs.
Yeah.
And part of that is because the world was moved online. So now there's a lot more availability to see what's out there. And there's a lot more online programs on the shelf because that's the only thing that was available for a long time. Now, a lot of people are buying things because they're being seduced by the sales pitch, or everything sounds really good. And we feel like we've got all this time, but the net effect of that is humans are not focused. And if you're not focused, you won't implement with enough attention or intention or commitment or time to get out of the implementation what you need. So we just barely implement. We just dip our toes in the water. We just watch a half of 3 of the 12 modules of an online program while we're watching another online program, while we're doing the dishes, while we're doing a bunch of other stuff. All these simultaneous competitors for our attention causes the human to not be focused enough to learn. And when we're talking about a journey that's going to require evolution or growth of any kind, you can't do that distracted. There has to be implementation. So many people don't ever shift into that laser focus. And from a practical standpoint, what I totally believe is pick one person to follow.
Please.
3 at most, 1 at best.
Yes.
If you believe in what they're teaching, then go all in what they're asking you to do, not what they're telling you to think, like implementation commitment. And for almost all humans, it will be easier to implement one thing than to implement more than one thing. And it just comes down to that level of simplicity. Because if the name of the game is implementation, then what's going to produce implementation? Simplicity is going to produce implementation more than distraction. So follow one person and go all in and implement what they're teaching you. And then when that learning is done, follow one other person. It's like having 10 horses at the beginning of a journey. And the difference is riding one horse at a time versus trying to ride all 10 of them at a time. ride one for a few steps and then ride another one for a few steps and then ride another one for 10 steps and just be fully distracted, you'll never even finish that journey because you're just going to go crazy switching from horse to horse. And that's the way our human attention span actually operates. So I don't want you to focus on what are you learning or how much information are you getting or how much time are you studying. What are you implementing? You can spend 100 hours studying all of real valuable information from 10 different teachers. You spend 100 hours learning and implement nothing. You're in worse position than before you learned, because now you're not implementing with a baggage full of information, and that's just heavier. It's harder. So learn with the sole purpose of implementing, because it's the only way you're actually going to grow. And one of the best ways to implement is simplify your inputs, go all in with implementation focus, and see what you learn. What do you want to add?
That's huge in my journey. And the other thing is that you don't waste any time questioning who's right, because you have so many different variables. So it's not only like we're trying to ride 10 different horses. It's like we have 10 different trainers teaching us how to ride each of those 10 different horses. And in that case, then
they're
it's
really
like, well,
good salespeople, all those trainers too. Yeah.
Absolutely. And here's the thing, what they do works for them, right? But you can't figure out what works for you unless you do what Sean, what you were just saying to do. So then we do something on horse number one with teacher number one, and then we get on horse number two, but we don't actually do what they do because we're sorting through our minds and be like, well, is this better? Is this worse than what I just learned over there on horse number one? And I'm not really sure which one of these is going to help me get to where I want to go. And so we implement even less because we spend so much time questioning when we haven't actually done anything to qualify the questioning. One teacher.
Yeah. That's huge.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is we can't know what the right thing is until we commit to it. So there's also nothing wrong with getting on a horse, committing to it 100% and riding it for 10 steps and realizing, oh, this is not the right horse for me now, but it's based on experience. And then jump on another horse, rather than, to your point, constantly being in the what's the right horse to be on. And you'll never, ever be able to commit inside of that level of fragmented questioning, because it's the questioning of what's right. But again, from a perspective that is incapable of knowing what's right.
Correct.
It's
We're not even on the horse. We're like standing on the ground, interviewing people, asking them what's the best way to ride. We haven't even gotten on the saddle yet.
Bless our hearts.
Yeah. The
fourth milestone is, this has become one of our like rally cries. Again, just because of what we see works and what doesn't work. It's, you must be a product of the product. If you're selling deep coaching, you must be a product of deep coaching. And that doesn't mean that there's an end, like a finish line to deep coaching. The product of deep coaching is ongoing, but you have to be a product of the thing that you're offering people. And surprise, most people are not. And it's not that most people aren't necessarily a product of the product, because a lot of people actually are a product of the product, but that's not what they're offering. They're actually not offering their productness of the product of deep coaching. They're offering something safe. So some people actually have this tuned up, like they've got this ready. They're just not using it, like from a strategic standpoint. But the point is, if you're trying to sell a product that you are not the product of, people will know. There's an energetic resistance, especially in light of all the things we've been talking about with all the mass distractions and all the stuff that humans are being exposed to now. People will know. And you have to understand what you're actually offering people. What are you actually selling? You're not selling the product. You're selling the outcome of the product. In coaching, that's what we're selling. We're selling the outcome of the product, which means you have to be an outcome of the product so that you can sell the outcome of the product. And this is an energetic shift to some degree, but then it can absolutely be strategic, because then we can look back and go, what did coaching actually produce in me? It produced, for me, it produced a level of commitment in my life, what I want to commit to in my life. It produced the ability to understand, become aware of, manage, eliminate, or be able to control limiting beliefs in my head. It produced the skill set of coaching, of speaking, of the confidence of influence. It produced so much as a result of what I purchased. And if people are not clients of coaches, then how are you going to sell a client's experience for you as the coach? And on one level, this is just a philosophical debate that I fully believe it's fraudulent to try to sell a product that you're not buying. I think it's fraudulent. But beside the philosophical debate, it's emotionally incongruent, because you're not going to be able to be an advocacy for people. You're not going to be able to understand what the outcome is and why people need to be on the other side of whatever it is that, the process is going to take them through. You won't be able to hold space for people in their decision-making to purchase the product. You won't be able to have certainty in your conversation about coaching. You won't be able to hold the space during the process of coaching unless you've gone through this whole process yourself as a client. And I know there's a much, much deeper conversation that we will unpack in another video of what it's like to coach as a client, and that, whole journey. And we'll put a card and a link to that video so you can unpack the whole conversation if you want. But the essence of being a product of the product is the emotional shift that you need to have for the energy. But then the understanding of being a product of the product is the strategic shift that you've got to have for the messaging and the marketing and what it is that you're actually offering to people.
Bingo.
Anything other than bingo?
I'm just concerned if I start talking about this, that I
will end up
won't.
doing the other video.
Yeah, that I won't, because this is what you just said is so critical. So I just want to repeat my version of it. It is an energetic and emotional shift. And I can tell you with more certainty and deep, deep knowing now than I have ever had at any point in my journey. It is the key strategic decision that I made, that I still make, and that the clients that we coach who have made this decision, that sets them apart in terms of their actual tangible success. Right. And I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Yeah. And watch the other video for us to unpack it further. And by the way, sometimes I forget to even mention this, but we are a coaching company. And so everything that we're talking about is the personal journey. And there's always a link below in our video descriptions to schedule a one-on-one call, because this is an individual process, which means you need individual attention and you need individual steps. So the fifth milestone, why don't you share this one? This is a huge transformation for you.
Yeah, it's moving from being a perpetual student into the identity of a teacher. So moving from student to teacher, which was my result of writing the About Me story from milestone number 1. It's just, I had to get to a point in my journey where I recognized that I had consumed enough, I had learned enough. It was time for me, and not only consumed and learned, I had actually implemented enough. I was a product of the product. I had, and not just consumed information, so I was giving out information. My life had transformed. And because I was so focused on where I wanted to go, until I wrote that story, I didn't actually look backwards to see how far I had already come, to be able to
Right.
recognize and visibly see that there were lessons that I could turn around and teach people, and that I needed to get out of just consuming more information. It got to a point where everything that I needed to learn for my next level was only going to come from me teaching. And so now it's more about, I am a student, but I'm a student teacher. Like, so
Yeah.
now I consume content, but I consume it to turn around and be like, okay, how can I take this and how can I teach this into the community? How can I teach this to the people that are following? And being a student is safe. I didn't know this at the time, but it was certainly like some sabotage and some protection, because it made me feel like I was actually doing something, because I was learning and I was showing up, and all of that is important. But it did get to a point where I knew I could be teaching this, and
Yeah.
I had to step out of that knowing and actually step into action. It's a huge identity shift.
Yeah, that's the key, is it's an identity shift. And like you said, it's something that you notice. I mean, there's intention here because you've got to consume in order to teach, but it's noticing, whether it comes through the About Me story, like you said, or it comes from just awareness or through your own coaching or whatever, noticing that you're in the position to get ready to make this shift, and the support that you need to make the shift, which is not easy. So the 6th milestone, why don't you do this one too? And then I'll take the last one.
Okay. Moving from coaching as an act, like it's something that you do, into coaching as an identity, right? So something that you be, which, like we talked about already, these are all foundational principles. So they interweave and they sit locked with each other. This is, for me, this was about, really through my client experience, this was about me getting to a place where this wasn't something that I did, right? Like I did this coaching thing. This became who I was. And I don't mean that I walked around coaching every single person in my life. It just, right? Because please don't, like, that's a no. It just meant that like I actually, like, really, because I was going through my own personal transformation, I became the work. And in the becoming of the work, it just wasn't something that I did anymore. It was something that I became. Like it was something that I was, right? I remember introducing myself at one of our 5-day ECCP events, and I didn't even think about it, but I said, I am this work. Like my life became evidence of the work. And when my life became evidence of what was possible, right, to what you said for me, it was the joy, it was the choosing of self, it was the internal control, it was the permission to be and speak and live completely authentically. When that happened, then my life became a testimonial for what was possible, and no longer something I had to do. It just was who I am.
My life became a testimonial. That goes back to obviously being a product of the product.
Yeah.
And a lot of these milestones that we're talking about, as they cycle around each other and feed into each other, being the essence of a coach, but through the client journey, is, I think, what's critical to pull out of what you just said. Because most people can't just see themselves as a coach or see themselves as a teacher or see themselves as a speaker and have it be internally embodied. unless they go through the embodiment work, unless they go through the internal work and then become the essence of that identity shift. That's what's going to give people more resiliency and rooted confidence, rather than just the fake microwave confidence that and false positive that a lot of people have. So this final one is placed on the end intentionally because I think it's the culmination of all the stuff that we've been talking about. And this is the transformation from the work to my work. And what I mean by that is the ownership of this work, to where you feel like you've got a body of work. And now, to your point just a moment ago, this is who you are. This is your work. So for you, it's a lot of things that you mentioned. It's self-love, and it's forgiveness, and it's dropping guilt and shame. And you've got so many lived experiences through this work, and you've taught it so many times. You've been in so many conversations and so many coaching sessions, both as a client and the coach, that you feel an ownership of this work, especially in certain applications of this work, certain topics, certain kinds of conversations. But you could have never known that in the beginning. And you could have never had that ownership without going through a lot of this work. So for me, my work is a lot around vulnerability and the masculine wound and healing division internally, inside of relationships, inside of families, inside of societies. But that really only came to me in the last few years because of doing my work. So this is sort of a, what's it called? Like a double entendre, I think, is like, it's kind of got a dual meaning. Yeah. My work from an ownership standpoint is, this is my work that I now do and that I teach, whether it's books or channels or whatever the way that you teach it is. You've got to get to a place, or my hope for all of you, although most people will never even come close to this because they won't do all the other stuff that we've been talking about, because this is a byproduct of all of this. But I hope that you are committed enough to get to the point where you can go, I now have my work. But that requires so much experience. And the way you get to the point where you now own my work is to do my work, meaning to do work on me. I've got to do the work on me. So I've got to do my work. And if I'm unconditionally committed and I go through all these milestones and I experience the abject failure and I learn all the lessons and all this stuff, at some point, you're going to feel ownership based on experience. But that ownership cannot happen through theory. It cannot be predicted. There's no way to know what your work is going to be until you do your work. It will reveal itself to you. Some of you, it might reveal itself in a few months from now. Some of you, it might be a few years from now. It doesn't matter that we compare details. But the only way to get to that point where you fully embody and own your work is to do your work until that shows up. And when that happens, there's a level of certainty, there's a level of embodiedness, there's a level of energy that comes out of your mouth that can't be quantified, either the process to get there or the measurement of it. It can't be quantified, but it can absolutely be felt. And the effects of it can be felt, whether it's in how you feel, like you personally, Michelle, I know you've gone through this and I've gone through this many times and many of our students have gone through this. When you open your mouth and you talk, you can feel the level of certainty that you have, but then you can measure in the reaction that other people have to your work. And in the coaching world, if you want to build a business, part of that will be people hiring you just for opening your mouth or just for posting something. Because like you can't hide embodied certainty. Even if you try, even if you get into a surface level conversation, there's going to be a level of deep wisdom that falls out because it's saturated, because it's who you are, because it's your work, because it's the essence of how you walk in the world now, because you become a teacher, because of all these things. The byproduct of that is people will feel a level of depth in their experience of you that will then attract them to you. And some of them will hire you, or they'll buy your books, or they'll start following you, or whatever the case is. Now, if you like this video, check out that video right there, where I'm going to teach you how to pick the best coaching niche for you. Not everybody in the room was a parent, because that's not the magnet that they were drawn to. But when I started talking about parenting, I saw the parents just lean in more. I saw more questions. It felt like there was more conviction